All right. Well, it's 9 o'clock. Actually, 9 o'clock Central Time, 10 o'clock Eastern Time. My name's John Sullivan. I'm the Global Director for Sales for Cosmetics and Pharmaceuticals at Registrar Corps. And we're very excited to have you for this webinar, a US FDA update, recent changes at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. I'm very excited to be able to introduce our speaker today, which is Dr. Elizabeth Duke. Dr. Duke is currently the Senior Vice President of Drug and Biological Therapies at Canal Road Advisors, where she advises life science innovators on regulatory strategy. She's also a practicing pediatric neuro-oncologist with expertise in oncology drug development and regulation. And until recently, she was a FDA clinical reviewer at CDER, Division of the Oncology 2, reviewing INDs, NDAs, and BLAs for oncology and rare disease products. She's also a contributor to FDA Oncology Center of Excellence initiatives, and she received her medical degree at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. She did a residency at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and she did her fellowship at Children's National Hospital. So without further ado, I'll hand this over to Dr. Duke. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. Really happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. If you go to the next slide, as I was preparing this talk, I really was trying to think about what would be most useful for you all to hear from me today. This is our agenda for the day. If you go to one more slide, I'll talk about my outline, which is particularly, a rundown of CDER by the numbers in 2025. And then I'll follow that with a deeper dive into several of the regulatory initiatives announced this past year, and end with some practical takeaways regarding expectations for drug submissions across the product lifecycle, what's changed, what hasn't, and what might be coming next. If you go to the next slide, again, we're all getting bombarded with news updates on novel programs and initiatives, stats on regulatory updates. It definitely can be hard to keep up with sometimes. So rather than just regurgitating those reports for you, I'll try to integrate the perspective of someone who did this work not very long ago. So this is the Building 32 cafeteria at FDA where we would have lunch. And that's just, to say this is, from the perspective of somebody who's done this and respects the FDA very much. Next slide. So 2025 saw major personnel changes. Per CDER's net hiring data, which you can find on the website, there were just over 1,000 net losses in 2025. That was actually only through the end of September, Q4. We had 5 CDER directors. Dr. Cavazzoni, she retired in January, followed by Dr. Corrigan Karai, serving in the acting role from January to July. Dr. Tidmarsh was appointed in July, Dr. Pazder in November, and then Dr. Hogue most recently in December. So there's been a lot of turnover. I would say in addition to the more newsworthy departures of senior leaders, many reviewer friends and colleagues left quietly, so no news articles or going away parties, but certainly a lot of losses there. And I think what's important here is that institutional knowledge is really a critical component of FDA's effectiveness. So, while we're seeing reports that FDA is hiring, the elimination of teams such as the learning and talent development staff, does raise some questions about how new reviewers will be trained. I vividly remember not knowing what an IND or an NDA review entailed when I started. And it was, of course, my divisional team, but also Suzanne Walker's team in learning and talent development who helped new CDER employees learn the basics. So it's possible that even as hiring picks up, with less experienced reviewers, companies may start to see some more inconsistency potentially, as well as conservative approaches across review teams. That said, The reviewers at FDA are truly tremendous individuals and will do everything in their power to keep the quality of their work high, despite increasing time and volume pressures. If you go to the next slide, there were 46 novel drugs approved in CDER in 2025, and that annual report just came out. You can find on their website too. That was 4 fewer than 2024 and 8 fewer than 2023. 43% were first in class, half received orphan drug designation, about a third were breakthrough therapies, and a quarter were approved under the accelerated approval pathway. And despite concerns about declining staff impacting timelines, 96% met their PDUFA goals. With 18 complete response letters in CDER, the rejection rate came out at about 28%, which is pretty stable over time. The number of advisory committees is worth noting. That was a near-term low with only 5 in 2025 compared to 10 to 20 in recent years. And as someone who participated in advisory committees, wrote slides, presented, I've definitely seen the impact they can have, and that decline, highlights a reduction in opportunities for external experts to provide input to the agency on key decision making, and particularly with their scientific expertise. So I think that's certainly something that we're watching and we'll keep an eye on in 2026. If you go to the next slide. In terms of guidances, there were 57 published this past year. Just about half were draft and half were final. The most common topics you'll see here in this pie chart were clinical, both medical and antimicrobial guidances, CMC and quality, other administrative guidances, and then ICH efficacy or multidisciplinary guidance. If you go to the next slide, you may recall last January, the White House ordered federal agencies to promote prudent financial management and alleviate unnecessary regulatory burdens by reducing private expenditure required to comply with federal regulations. And that meant for the FDA that for each new regulation issued, at least 10 prior regulations should be identified for elimination. So 57 guidances still sounds like a lot. FDA did find ways to navigate that with some minor guidances that can be withdrawn, and then guidances that can be framed as deregulatory. If you go to the next slide, I think it's also important to talk about inspections. So there were about 2,000 foreign and domestic inspections for drug products specifically in 2025. And if you look at this chart, that's a pretty low number compared to any other time in recent history, with the exception of the pandemic years, which are obviously striking. In terms of those inspection results, there was no action indicated for just about half. And then for the other half, a small number, 8%, had an official action indicated. The remainder were voluntary action indicated. And I'm lucky enough to work closely with several members now who had led inspections at the FDA for many decades. And they talk about how this really is an issue for companies with fewer inspections, limited resources, companies that end up falling into regulatory jeopardy, so say an OAI violative inspection, probably will have a harder time getting off that OAI non-compliance list, since doing so typically involves a reinspection. So it really makes it all the more important for companies to conduct their own due diligence, maintaining a culture of quality, and avoid ending up in that category. Next slide. All right, I want to dive into some of the more notable regulatory initiatives in 2025. And I'll show you on the next slide. This is the FDA's current homepage. So certainly speaks to the number of efforts, not just in CDER, but across the agency that we're frequently hearing about in the news. Next slide. So this was announced in 2025, the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher, or CNPV program. And it's described as applying a collaborative tumor board style review process to accelerate approvals for companies that are aligned with critical US national health priorities. And FDA is accepting requests to participate. You can go on the website and you can still see that form there. And stated a plan really to award a limited number of vouchers on a rolling basis. The criteria have yet to be fully clarified in terms of how those decisions are being made. The short application involves a description of how the drug would basically address one of 5 priorities, and those are listed here. 1 is addressing a US public health crisis. 2, delivering more innovative cures for the American people. 3, addressing a large unmet medical need. 4, increasing affordability. Or 5, onshoring drug development and manufacturing to advance the health interests of Americans and strengthen US supply chain resiliency. So those are the 5 priorities that are listed. If you go to the next slide, you'll see sort of the numbers here. When the first batch of vouchers was issued in October 2025, we're now in February 2026, and the total is at 18. The most recent vouchers were awarded December 19th, and those were for investigational therapies intended to lower LDL cholesterol and to treat advanced lung cancer. The only approval via this program so far was for extended release Augmentin, the antibiotic, which per the FDA press release, quote, demonstrated clear alignment with the CNPV program's national health priorities by strengthening the US drug supply chain through enhanced domestic manufacturing capacity at a US facility, unquote. There have been some questions about the processes surrounding this program and the role of the review division in the decision-making process. I can't speak to that specifically, but I do know that FDA reviews are intensive. They evaluate patient-level data. They require iterative, collaborative discussions among many review disciplines. And then ultimately, in order to come to a decision about the benefit risk, the determination of substantial evidence, whether a study is adequate and well controlled, that's all a conversation within the review team, and those typically take time and have evolution. So this short time frame is something that I wonder about. Next slide. All right, rare disease. This is a space that's very near and dear to me. So I was actually listening to the RISE meeting, Rare Disease Innovation, Science and Exploration meeting, RISE, in September, when Dr. Tidmarsh first described the Rare Disease Evidence Principles, or RDEP pathway. And it was described as a cross CDER, so Center for Drugs, Center for Biologics process to facilitate approval of drugs to treat rare diseases with very small populations, with significant unmet medical need, and with a known genetic defect that's the major driver of the pathophysiology. And the description on the FDA website states that sponsors may apply at any time prior to the launch of a pivotal trial if they meet the 4 program criteria. And so they talk about ultra rare populations and say less than 1,000 persons in the US, it being intended to treat a known inborn genetic defect that's a major driver of pathophysiology, so that's pretty specific. The clinical course being progressive deterioration in function, leading to rapid decline or death in a short period of time, so not a slowly progressive disease that's harder to sometimes measure endpoints. And then no adequate alternative therapies. And then for drugs that meet the criteria, FDA would expect that substantial evidence of effectiveness may generally be established based on 1 adequate and well-controlled study that may be a single-arm trial, together with robust data that provides strong confirmatory evidence of the drug's treatment effect. Now, if that sounds familiar, that makes sense because it actually sounds a lot like the substantial evidence guidance that provides the background that all the way back in 1997, Congress amended Section 505D to confirm FDA's interpretation of the statutory requirements, making it clear that FDA could consider data from 1 adequate and well-controlled clinical investigation plus confirmatory evidence to constitute substantial evidence of effectiveness. And that was if FDA determined that the data were sufficient to establish effectiveness. So it remains to be seen what's different here, but definitely curious to see where this goes. On the next slide, what is new and announced via journal publication in November of 2025 is this concept of a plausible mechanism pathway. So this is an initiative that would allow FDA to consider marketing authorization for highly individualized or bespoke therapies when traditional randomized trials are not feasible, especially in ultra-rare, severe diseases, basically by relying on a strong mechanistic rationale tied to a known specific biological abnormality and then a directly targeted intervention. We have not yet seen official FDA guidance on this, but it is on the CDER guidance agenda for 2026. So hopefully some more details forthcoming. And we have not seen any evidence that the pathway has been used as formal basis for an approval just yet. In theory, it would require the points laid out here in the article, which is evidence of mechanistic engagement. So for example, successful editing or drugging of an intended molecular target, an observable clinical improvement in patients, well-characterized disease natural history, which is often challenging in rare diseases where you have small populations. And really, you want to be able to distinguish the true treatment effect from expected progression, which is always the case in drug development. This probably is going to apply more often in CDER than CDER, although there are certainly instances where you could think about this pathway being proposed for new drugs. Next slide. All right, we can't escape 2025 without talking about AI. So I did indeed use the internal agency-wide ELSA tool. Obviously, a lot of skepticism here, but it is strictly internal to FDA. Staff are very much advised to use it as a support tool, not a decision maker. Outputs should be checked and verified by human reviewers before being relied upon in any way for any sort of regulatory analysis or decision. So that's very much what folks are doing. In December, FDA announced the deployment of agentic AI capabilities for all agency employees. So I was not there for that, but in theory, enabling the creation of more complex AI workflows to assist with multi-step tasks. And then as far as externally facing AI initiatives, FDA published draft guidance frameworks outlining how AI models should be evaluated, both for credibility and then ultimately used to support regulatory decision-making for drugs and biologics. And you may have seen just after New Year, FDA and EMA together published this guiding principles for good AI practice in drug development, providing a regulatory framework really intended to support responsible use of AI across the drug lifecycle, and listed these factors here that are of paramount importance, and you'll see this in the other AI guidances as well. The concept of human-centric by design, that you have a risk-based approach, adherence to standards, you have a clear context of use. Why are you using this? What is the context of it? Multidisciplinary expertise, data governance and documentation, model design, development practices, risk-based performance assessment, lifecycle management. As time goes on, how are you going to make sure that it keeps doing what you think it's doing, and clear essential information. So all of that sort of makes sense, but pretty interesting that the FDA and EMA did that together. That is not the most common that we see. So if you go to the next slide, real-world evidence is another topic that's been talked about for many years. In December, we did hear that FDA would potentially accept real-world evidence drawn from de-identified data sources for certain medical device reviews, potentially without patient-level data, which has been a historical requirement. And that, of course, raises questions, could ultimately broaden the use of available data sets like registries or EHRs for regulatory evaluation. But I will note that, despite signaling increasing regulatory flexibility on aspects such as auditing of real-world data, we have seen several complete response letters this past year for submissions, including real-world data. So there's a lot of nuance here. The devil's in the details, and it's worth working with FDA early and often to understand what their expectations are with respect to any sort of innovative trial design. And then Bayesian statistics is an interesting one. Certainly many statisticians at FDA have been talking about and recommending the use of this type of statistics for many years. We did see this guidance just published outlining FDA's current thinking on Bayesian methodology in clinical reviews. How can those be used to design and analyze trials, basically formally combining prior information with current trial data to produce a posterior distribution for inference, emphasizing that these methods are particularly useful for adaptive designs or when you're thinking about interim decisions, borrowing external information, augmenting control data. So a lot of potential uses of that when justified, and pre-specified is always important. If you go to the next slide, I want to turn to some practical takeaways, thoughts for the coming year. And if you go to the next one, as I talked about, there are quickly evolving regulatory announcements, and some of them overlap with existing regulations and guidance. Others are entirely new. So the question, begs, do these trends indicate changing regulatory priorities? And you could say to some extent, but for example, the one adequate and well-controlled trial plus confirmatory evidence to demonstrate substantial evidence of effectiveness for approval, that's been used in oncology and rare disease for decades, right? So those are not new concepts. And one question is, will they now be applied more broadly? In what disease areas? What will that be based on? And so those are all important areas to watch and see what is coming through in terms of approvals. There certainly are fewer reviewers to do the same job. And, like I said, the impact of that has yet to be fully elucidated. I do think there will be less tolerance, I would say, for unclear narratives, probably, potentially reduced informal communications just with less time, and then increased use of at least AI-assisted screening, if not analysis, and then the variability of that across divisions certainly is going to be a factor. And I think, I have to say, despite expanding, innovative programs, reviewers still very much operate under the existing statutory standards. So adequate and well-controlled trials, substantial evidence, overall benefit risk assessment. That is sort of ingrained in the thought process. And so, independent of other announcements, that very much is still there and, a part of the daily process in terms of reviewing. So there will be an impact, I think, across phases of development. What should sponsors do or verify to stay aligned with CDER expectations? I know you all hear this often, but, meeting with FDA on key aspects of development, asking them the specific questions. Do you agree with this plan? And I think especially when you're thinking about innovative designs, complex analyses. And don't just assume because there's an innovative approach being discussed at a public meeting or in another disease area that those exact same considerations apply for your development program. There's always nuance, right? There's always a reason why your precedent or a precedent is different from your particular program. And so I think mechanistic, rationale matters, biologic rationale matters, the setting of the disease matters. So there's so many details that it's worth sort of having that conversation with the relevant review division and getting their feedback. And whether that's through the usual type B meeting, type C meeting, the more recently established type D meeting. So if you have a more straightforward question or two questions to ask, or even, the type F meeting, oncology relatively recently established for initial pediatric study plans. And so, taking advantage of those opportunities to meet with the FDA and gain their alignment. Being clear in all submissions, avoiding simple errors. I know that sounds very obvious, but you would be surprised at the number of, spelling, grammatical errors that we would see all the time in protocols, and just making sure that, you want to be taken seriously as much as the FDA, wants to use their time well. And so just avoiding that when you can. Don't assume precedent. You know, like I said, there's always caveats that make an individual development program different. And there's a lot of times details that you may not know about a particular program, you know, that was not announced in the press release that made it different. And so I think that's part of that process of having that conversation. And then don't assume FDA is aligned or knows what you're doing. There have a million programs sort of that they're constantly, you know, looking at. And so providing clear, scientifically sound justification for why you chose a dose or why you're choosing this control arm, clearly stating your plan for development early and then updating them. You know, if you have a relevant change, we decided to move forward with this dose into phase 3 and this is why. Or we're revising our statistical analysis plan because of X. You know, having those conversations along the way can save you a lot of headache at the end. All right, if you go to the next slide. What's happening in 2026? You know, it's going to be an interesting year for sure. There's a lot of movement with PDUFA 8 negotiations throughout the year. That timeline is here. Discussions about updates to patient labeling, biosimilars. You've seen a lot of that in the news recently. Again, looking at the hiring patterns, drug review timelines. Does that shift as the year goes on? Does the meeting PDUFA rate stay at 96%? And then what additional clarity might we get on the voucher program? I'll be very interested to see. Some of those decisions have already been delayed. What does that look like moving forward as those timelines come up? And then, you know, certainly we expect the conversation around modernization of clinical trials for rare disease to continue. That's not going anywhere. The patient advocacy groups have made that very clear. And I think it's important to have those conversations with the FDA, and the science is here. So it'll be fascinating to watch that all come. Of course, in compliance and inspection, the pre-check pilot program announced that will begin accepting applications in February. And so certainly a lot of movement. You know, again, some things stay the same. The regulations are always there, but exciting to think about what we're going to see in 2026. So that's it. I'm happy to take questions from you all.
So before we get to the Q&A, if we can get to the next slide real quick. Maybe. There you are. So I just wanted to talk real quick about some of the services that Registrar Corps offers in regards to drug compliance. And so you can see here, we do everything from FDA registration, US agent, third-party logistics and wholesale drug distribution, licensure reporting. We do work with master files, with global agency assistance, and we have a lot of different online training courses. So we cover basically everything you need to do any type of compliance with the drug side, and we're happy to help. Next slide. So number one, we're one of the largest, if not the largest, regulatory compliance company out there, and we do a lot more than just drug compliance. We also work on food and beverage, medical device, and cosmetics. So we've been in business for over 20 years, have over 32,000 customers in 190 different countries. It says we offer 27 services, but we offer a lot more than that now. And really importantly, we're ISO 27001 certified, so you can rest assured that any information you're sending us is secure. So again, very happy to help. Last slide before we get questions. We have some information here. If you want to get a hold of us, you have our phone number as well as an email to send us if you're looking for assistance. We're also offering for this webinar 15% off any of our services through February 25th. So if you reach out and try to contact us, we'll give you that discount, and we're glad to help. So with that, there is a button over there, a question button, where you can type in questions, and Dr. Duke will gladly answer them, and we'll go from there. There's a lot of people attended today, so again, thank you very much for attending, and hope you have some questions that we can try to answer. We'll stand by. Don't see any questions yet. You might have just been so thorough, Dr. Duke, that there's no questions that
I
need
don't
to be
know. There
asked.
you go. It's a lot of, TBD, right? There's so many aspects that are exciting and that we're hearing about, but it's hard to say a lot of times, right? How that's actually going to play out. I think the CNPV is an interesting example of that. So
we have a couple questions coming in now.
yeah. Do you expect the number of inspections to continue to fall? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, our team at Canal Row is keeping an eye on this and involved, from the consulting side. I think the question is sort of how are the resources being allocated and how will they continue to be allocated, understanding that they're limited. And so, it doesn't seem like they're continuing to decline necessarily, but I think one aspect is this concept of unannounced foreign inspections. I think that has been a topic of conversation. And so if that happens, could that potentially reduce the overall number of inspections just from a numbers perspective, right? Because if you have unannounced inspections, you have more challenges, right? That's multiple inspections potentially needed in a single trip. You're planning around local holidays, you're obtaining visas, there's jurisdictional issues, right, that maybe make demanding to allow a visit difficult. And so depending kind of where the resources are spent, I think that will matter. I think this idea of simple reform was also something that we're kind of keeping an eye on, this idea of merging medical product and clinical research inspections into kind of a more general inspectorate. Obviously, these are very highly complex issues, right? And so just like a drug reviewer knows a lot about a given disease area and not so much about other disease areas, consolidation within the inspectorate could potentially slow things down. So I think it's something that we have to sort of watch and see kind of where the agency goes with that.
And then, but the first one, yep, they're coming in hard and fast now. So the first one's from Lisa at the bottom there.
Okay. Are there resources to access lists of rare disease FDA is working on? That's a really interesting question. So I actually just this morning found the list of surrogate endpoints. And so that's relevant in terms of thinking about novel endpoints for rare disease. So that's worth kind of Googling that one. Lists of rare disease. The other thing to know, so patient-focused drug development, there's an externally led patient-focused drug development program where it's often rare diseases who come and basically present their case to FDA, not about a particular drug, but about their disease, and say, look, this is who we are. These are the issues that we are most concerned about, and can you please, think about drug development in this area? And so just providing FDA with that knowledge. So that's a good place to list or look at in terms of rare diseases that have kind of come before the FDA. In terms of a specific list, I can't think of one, but that's an interesting idea. All right.
See, where will there be more mutual reliance?
I don't think I know what that means specifically. I wonder if that's with inspections. Sarah, feel free to clarify. What impact can we expect on projected dates overseas inspections and Oh, for inspections and reviews on submitted ANDAs. Ooh, that is a great question. I was in, O&D was less involved with generics, so I don't have a perfect answer for that, but I think it's an interesting thing that we'll have to keep an eye on. It seems like, they're doing the best they can in terms of those timelines, but I do think that's an interesting question. Let me see.
Angela Turner, any focus on guidance for CDER this year to be drafted for industry or specific, I have to read this up, for specific areas like CMC and clinical?
CDER to this year, for industry. Focus on guidances for CDER this year to be drafted. Yes, you can. So they publish that, and I can put it in the chat in a second. But they're all listed out. And so when I mentioned the one about the plausible mechanism pathway, that was on the CBER guidance agenda, but those are all already out there, and so you can sort of read to see whether there are specific ones that are relevant for you. But they cross all disciplines, so clinical, non-clinical, clin pharm. All right. Do you see the advisory committees next? Number of advisory committees to be sporadic. I have not seen any indication that this is going to change. And this was, probably middle last year when they all sort of got shut down, canceled. They weren't really having any more. So I anticipate that we're not going to see more than we saw. But that's a prediction. And I think, if there becomes a reason, that leadership thinks that these may become, useful again, we may see an uptick, but I don't see that changing very shortly.
So the next one from Christine is, has FDA released additional information about how it is using AI internally in various areas such as application review, post-market surveillance, ad promo review, etc.?
Yeah, I have not seen any released information about how they're doing it. I think when sponsors ask, or some will say, don't use my information, right, in your AI system, and FDA has a kind of, stock response to that, which is that we don't use it for decision making. It's for kind of structural formatting, supportive use. That's sort of what I've heard, but I have not seen anything formally written.
And then Michelle asks, are there any difference in applying for the US FDA for a company that sells medical equipment, in particular for dentistry? And what about the price to get it?
Any differences in applying for the US? I wonder if you mean differences from other countries in applying for the US FDA for a company that sells medical equipment. Interesting. So that would be CDRH probably. So that's devices. And so that would be a question for them. I don't know exactly, what specifically you're asking about differences, but I think that would be the place that you would want to go, and the price to get it. Yeah. As the FDA often says, we don't regulate cost, we don't talk about cost as much as we know that it impacts patients and it's important. And, the FDA really does try and maintain, distance from the regulation of cost of medicines and products.
I would say if you do have questions on medical device, we can help register our course. So that email that was listed, please email us and we'll have someone that at least can talk you through it. So and then you can make decisions from there.
Great.
And then Angela Turner, what is the direction for colorants in drug products where the food industry has to remove all petroleum-based and drug is only required to remove number 3 red? Will the drug industry have to also remove this group of colorants if not deemed safe in food?
It's a great question. We have not seen it yet. We hadn't gotten, guidance on that, or, at least to the point that I was there, and I haven't seen anything in the public press. But but there is clearly a focus on this, as we're seeing broadly, and so it would not surprise me if that was something that became part of the conversation. Certainly when CMC and non-clinical, everybody's talking about, the quality and excipients and all of that, it's always a conversation. And so whether those become more of the conversation, I think that's very possible.
And then the last question before we close is from Lindy. Lindy asks, I just covered it, sorry. Oh, there we go. Since there is a decrease in inspections, is there a specific focus for inspections or criteria used to decide if an inspection will be done for an application?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's important. And I think, detail dependent on your application. And so worth, thinking about. There certainly are criteria that are set, right, that they're always thinking about. I can say from a drugs perspective, when there's something that's new, right, a new drug application, we think about a little differently from a supplemental drug application, let's say. And then when we think about the data that are in that, inspections of pieces that are relevant to the assessment of safety and efficacy are probably, going to be of foremost importance, right? So if you have an oncology drug, for example, and you have MRIs and your primary endpoint is response rate, looking at the data that are relevant for that particular endpoint, so the ORR data, as opposed to some of the other demographic data that may or may not impact your primary endpoint. So I do think some of those kind of clinical decisions end up being relevant in terms of when you have less resources and you want to be able to sort of be more specific about what areas you're thinking about for inspection. And then whether it will be done at all, certainly depends on history. Has that particular place been inspected recently, or were there any concerns before? So those are all considerations that have been there and probably will continue to be moving forward.
Thanks, Dr. Duke. And then Michelle just asked if you could let her know again, what is it called, the registration for the medical devices? You said that was the acronym?
Yeah. Center for Devices and Radiologic Health. I'm just reporting in the chat. And that's CDRH.
CDRH, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is, unfortunately, Anne-Marie Davis, I see you raised your hand. But we not sure how we can take voices. So if you have a question, you can write it in there. Okay, so we good, you put it in there. Thanks so much. Again, everyone, thank you for joining this call. We really appreciate your time. Dr. Duke, we really appreciate you coming on today to talk about this topic. And we will have this available. You can also email again on the info@registrarcore.com, and we can send you a copy of the recording as well and the slides. So other than that, we'll go from there. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.